Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Right now, crop resilience is a major topic for discussion. But what does it mean for this growing season? How can farmers achieve reliable results with their crops? Joining us today are Agrii's John Miles, Seed Technical Manager, Tom Land, National Fertiliser Manager, Jonathan Trotter, Technical Trials Manager, and Jody Littleford, Technical Manager for Combinable Crop Trials. So, good morning to you all. John, could you set the scene by sharing a little bit about how you're seeing the crops across the UK right at the moment?
Reports from across the country is that crops are looking really good. Earlier drill dates, even though we've had some period of cold, I'd say it's been quite relatively kind. Crops seem to have kept moving. And some of the late drill crops around me in Cambridgeshire have come really nicely as well. So crops couldn't be set up much better from an establishment and biomass phase for big yields.
Ah, fantastic. So we can relax, can we?
No.
I knew you were going to say that. Why can't we relax, John? What's on your mind?
Well, anybody that's been unfortunate enough to listen to me at farmer meetings so far this spring, or actually will listen to me some point before March, I'm really scared, Tony, about a one in a decade scenario that we haven't seen for quite a long time. Now, I grew up with my dad being a farm manager, and I remember him talking about Brigadier and Savannah, for yellow rust. When I was at CPB Twyford, I was there running trials when we had Robigus, and then I was in the commercial team, when we had Oakley and Santiago. All of those varieties had big rust issues. Since those days, we've had, people would know, YR15, we've had the Costello Siskin genetics, and we've had a really mundane period of security when it comes to our protection on rust. And what we saw last year, and only if you had untreated areas that for the whole season did the rust get embedded, but we saw a new race take out that resistance gene, that major gene, be overcome across the country. So, yes, all right, it's, is it academically interesting? There's a new race out there. Yes, it is. But the reason I'm worried, Tony, is that when you go back to the Oakleys and the Robiguses and the Brigadiers and the Slepners, what you had was a race change, but you also had a huge area of susceptible varieties out there on farm where if the conditions were right for rust, it blew up because there was just, acres and acres of susceptible stuff. Now, back in October, I looked at seed sales, and according to our ratings, and we are a bit harsher than AHDB ratings, but there are 42.5% of the wheat area is down to varieties less than a 3.9 for yellow rust. And there's another 34 in that 4 to 5 bracket. And considering the challenges we've got with finances and growing crops this year, to do that as cheaply as possible means staying in front of disease, because eradicating rust in a well-grown crop and trying to get it out once it's already embedded is going to cost more money and is going to be more of a challenge. So my big thing is, please, let's just recognize the situation we're in and think about what we can do to stay in front of the crops and stopping that disease getting in from the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Jody, I'm going to come to you just in a second, but first of all, Tom, is the potential there in the crops, though, if we're able to manage disease?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a good crop in the ground, and it looks well, and it's captured lots of free nitrogen that's floating about in the soil. I was just thinking about what John was saying in terms of if you have varieties that maybe potentially are more susceptible, then before you think about your nitrogen fertilizer, maybe start thinking about, John was saying, sort of maybe a prophylactic approach is thinking about first time out with a sprayer, maybe with a manganese and zinc foliar or something like that, to try and just help build a bit of resilience in the plant, strengthen the plant leaves up, and help to reduce that early, development of the disease potentially. But maybe if growers are focused on cost, maybe they they identify more susceptible sites and target their approach accordingly, really.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we know that growers are very, very focused on their, the cost of the inputs they're putting in. Jody, can you pick up on what John was saying there about any thoughts there about, the chemistry that's available and what is the best approach to ensuring this disease doesn't lift off?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, John's comment there around, we've lost quite a lot of effective chemistry over, a number of years. And when you look at the chemistry toolbox that we have available to us now, the vast majority of it is protectant chemistry. We're lacking a lot of that curative, eradicant activity that, we would have had in some of the older chemistry. So, John's point around being proactive and trying to keep ahead of the disease is, incredibly pertinent. And, Tom's comment as well, equally around, trying to create a healthy plant and, maintain that crop health, making sure that it's got available nutrients, micronutrients, again, is all going to contribute to how that plant can combat that disease and fend it off. But it needs to be a joined up approach with, applying the right chemistry at the right time, keeping application timings tight to make sure that you are applying that chemistry protectantly, and then using other tools available to us to build resilience into that system, like some of the biostimulants that we've talked about on previous podcasts.
And Jonathan, I can see that you've been listening to this conversation with some nods. What are your thoughts? What's the best approach to managing this potential disease pressure?
Yeah, I think it's about looking forward and being on top of your game in terms of looking for signs of disease early and monitoring the conditions, maybe monitoring forecasts a bit more closely. But it's also about looking back at how things have traditionally done in that field or in that corner or that area of the farm, and using technology perhaps to kind of identify perhaps where things have gone wrong in the past. So either analysing yield maps, for example, or having a closer look at satellite imagery and kind of analysing how does that field normally do, what does good look like, what does bad look like, is this a normal year, is it a not normal year, and kind of having a real in-depth think about how those areas of your farm might play into kind of this scenario that we're perhaps going to see this coming spring.
So let's move on to that area of nutrition. Tom, I know this is, really where you like to share your passionate top tips for the coming season, but what are the drivers for this year? What do growers need to get right?
The backdrop this year that's probably in the front of a lot of growers' minds is so how much am I going to spend on all of these different aspects that each of us are going to talk about today, and go, well, Jody, I'm going to spend so much on biostimulants, or maybe, I'm going to cut that, or Tom, I'm not going to spend so much on fertilizer, or I'm going to use less fertilizer. And I think they're all decisions that growers are really focused on in terms of how much they're going to invest in the crop this year. I think I've kind of wound the clock back to around the Ukraine war, when fertilizer prices went through the roof, and we saw break-even ratios get to 7.5 for nitrogen. Well, we're nearly at that point today. If you look at the price of nitrogen fertilizer and unfortunately the grain prices to where it is today, and it drives a lot of people's thinking to say, well, do I make an economic cut in nitrogen? And I was just looking at some sums, and I think if you get the nitrogen rate wrong this season by just making a decision based around emotions, potentially that's £226 a hectare of lost revenue. So you've got to think really carefully about, how do I get this nitrogen recommendation or nitrogen rate right this season? And at the same time, I've got the weather coming at me, and is it going to turn bone dry? And am I going to have the same spring as what I had last season? So there's so many things for a grower to think about, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is a term which is often used. I.e., we've got to take a rational look at how much nitrogen is in the soil this season. It looks to be good. It looks like residual SMN levels look to be up, but that's probably due to the carryover from last season in terms of poorly utilised N. But actually, crops have gone in well. They've got good captured N in the canopies. So a well-calculated nitrogen recommendation will probably get you to a better place on the dartboard than maybe just making a rash decision. And that principle applies not just in cereals, but also across crops like oilseed rape this season.
why not download Agrii's latest Insight Report, Beyond the Bottom Line, Tackling Rising Costs with Smarter Margins. Visit agrii.co.uk/insights. Now, John, what are you thinking?
Oh, I've got a question for Tom. I mean, what we have seen in the last couple of years, and well, in East Anglia we get dry springs, so the strategy has always been to put increasing amounts of fertiliser on early, bang it in while we got some moisture, get it in the system. But I guess the bit that's different for me this year is that crop biomass. The weather. Do we need plans A, B, and C so that we can react to the weather? Because how would you go looking after these big biomass crops, but then get enough in the system, but not overcook it? Because as you said at the beginning, the danger of overcooking it and getting a lush, thick crop full of nitrogen is going to cost you money on chemicals. That's the thing I'm asking you.
Yeah, and it goes through my mind a lot, John, but it seems so consistent these days that I started life talking about 50 kilos of nitrogen first pass, and then we'll start building the N in. But I still think, given the size of the crop out there, and we've still got until the 31st of March to lose N through the soil, that if growers are thinking of going early, to maybe be considering more than that 50 kilos, making sure there is a reasonable amount of N in the system. And I think probably 90% of growers, just making a number up there, will be going early with a large dose of N, because we've seen this so many times year on year. And unfortunately, when soils turn dry, conversion of nitrogen becomes less. So if you've got a crop with lots and lots of tillers demanding lots and lots of N from the soil, that you're going to start losing tillers, and then potentially that might result in yield loss. So I think a safe bet would be to go out with a reasonably sensible amount of nitrogen. Don't go crazy, but I'd be thinking somewhere around 70 to 80 kilos of nitrogen potentially, as the first pass. So there's a reasonable amount of N in the system.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I saw you nodding your head just now. What were you thinking?
I was just thinking about how there's that phrase that's not yet been mentioned, but you can only manage what you measure. And I think there's still plenty of time to take soil samples, get some SMN results, and actually start to have a look at what is left in that soil, so you're not guessing at that. And then combining that with the kind of biomass that you're working with, I think there's a lot of potential there to really fine-tune what people do this spring in terms of nitrogen.
What other data, Jonathan, can people be looking at, farmers be looking at, to be sure they're making the best decisions they can?
Well, utilised tool is the ability to variably apply things like nitrogen. I think there's something like 35% of Agrii's customers currently use variable rate nitrogen tools. I think that needs to be higher. I think there is a necessity within that in terms of where the price of nitrogen is and the conditions that we've been talking about. I think these tools are there, they're available. All of Agrii's customers have access to satellite imagery. If they then want to use that for variable rate nitrogen plans, they can do. So yeah, I think there's a really golden opportunity there for growers this year.
And Tom, thinking about what you said about nutrition and listening to Jonathan there, what's different this year? What do farmers need to do in order to build in resilience in their crops and ensure the bottom line financially is the best outcome for them?
I think the key this year is maybe, like we started the conversation, is identify where your potential problems may be, and maybe address them accordingly, rather than maybe going out there and trying to do everything and tick every box. But tissue analysis combined with a good soil analysis could help understand a lot of potential pitfalls you might find along the way, i.e. through the rest of the season. Because a quick look across at Mulder's chart, you can suddenly start to identify whether you potentially may be more prone to any in-season deficiencies that you might see.
Yeah. Jody, where do biostimulants fit? Because you were talking before we come on air about, helping to build a buffer, which, whatever the season throws at us could be very valuable. Where do they fit? Can you summarise that for us?
Yeah, so I suppose there's several kind of categories of biostimulants that, we could talk about, following on from the discussion around, nutrient availability to crops. I suppose that brings endophytes into the conversation. So, endophytes have been talked around, the last few years. People are kind of gaining, more experience of them. And I know that we've looked at them quite in depth in trial to kind of understand, where we can best use them and actually where are some of the pitfalls of their use as well. And endophytes are, live microbial organisms. So, they need to be handled with care to make sure that they are actually applied correctly and therefore can, colonize the plant to therefore be able to reap their benefits. We have largely seen them as being, contributing on top of the nitrogen that's already been applied to the crop, rather than necessarily being used as a tool to reduce nitrogen input. So, they can make a good crop better by providing additional atmospheric nitrogen. That might be where situations where, you've got a good crop, you can see that there's, more potential there. You don't necessarily want to spend the additional budget on nitrogen, so you might therefore use your endophytes in that at that point to kind of boost that crop and give it some additional nitrogen. On the other side, you've got plant health biostimulants, and particularly this year I know I'm talking a lot around elicitor products, and in particular peptide elicitors, because again we've been doing a lot of work on those the last couple of years. And, looking at the situation that we've got out there at the moment, there's, a high risk of disease potential in these crops. And actually, there's active disease kicking about in some of these crops as well. So, we've talked around being proactive in the management of disease. And we can't forget about, the septoria risk out there at the moment as well with earlier drill timings. So using these peptide elicitors, what we're essentially doing is switching on the plant's hypersensitive response, which essentially builds a bit of a buffer into that disease control system.
Thanks, Jody. Great advice as always. And it brings us towards the end of this particular podcast. And as we always do, I'm going to ask each of you for your top tips. What would you urge growers to do that gives us a chance of building some resilience into our cropping output this year? John, would you like to go first?
As we saw last year with the yellow rust, the weather plays such a crucial role about, I used the phrase, it was Goldilocks. It was either too hot or too cold or too dry. And actually if we have a nice mild spring with some nice sunlight and some decent dews, the rust will really love it. So we have to appreciate that our future for this spring is held in that weather. It could be a no-show and everyone could go, what the hell was John batting on about? So we just have to appreciate that weather. But my top tip would just be walk, 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 walk.
Okay, very good. Tom, from a nutritional perspective, what would be your top tips? Is it back to basics and get those right, or is it attention to detail?
I'm afraid it's a combination of the two, really, Tony. It is understand how much residual ends in the soil, because it will help build a more accurate end recommendation. But also at the same time, the dry season last season would have resulted in potentially more K being taken off. So if you're taking soil samples, maybe have a look at potassium levels and don't forget about sulfur. And without me waffling on for ages, they're my top tips.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. Jody, just remind us, where do those biostimulants fit and what's the core benefit?
So I think the key thing to remember is that, biostimulants and biosolutions are tools, and that, they're not replacements for the fundamentals of, the agronomy approach to that crop.
And Jonathan, let's leave the final comment. What would you urge growers to do?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier so it sinks in, but you can only manage what you measure, and I think that's really important.
Thank you, John, Tom, Jody and Jonathan, for your timely advice on building resilience in the performance of our cereal crops. Do stay tuned here on Tramlines, recent episodes live from events and discussions on varieties, nutrition and much more. If you have any questions for our experts that you'd like answered, email them in to info@agrii.co.uk. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. See you next time.